Finally, it looked as though the pressure was paying off. In opposition, Keir Starmer's Labour Party had, of course, legitimised Israel's genocidal rampage in Gaza, including the now Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, backing Israel's right to cut off water and energy to civilians. It refused to back a ceasefire for months, and as Gaza was wiped from the face of the earth, its people violently displaced, its hospitals destroyed, and tens of thousands of people exterminated, Labour stood behind what was termed Israel's right to self-defence. The party opposed ending arms sales. It legitimised the decision to pull the plug on funding to UNRWA, the main humanitarian organisation during a humanitarian catastrophe, based on a pack of lies, and it cast doubt on South Africa's case of genocide at the International Court of Justice. The now Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, described that as a distraction. It suspended Labour MPs who stood against the depravity, while shadow ministers who backed a ceasefire were sacked or resigned. And when predominantly Muslim councillors quit in disgust, a Labour source boasted the party was shaking off the fleas. And when, after many, many months, it finally backed a ceasefire, it did only because the Scottish National Party had cornered it on the issue by introducing a motion, and then Labour proceeded to gut that motion, stripping away mentions of collective punishment, which Israel is guilty of, because that would mean taking action rather than relying on words. Well, what a difference getting a slap from the electorate can make. You see, Labour won its landslide, albeit on a paltry third of the vote, amidst the lowest turnout in the history of British democracy. But it lost seats to the Greens and 5 independents standing on anti-genocide tickets, with 2 shadow cabinet ministers facing humiliating losses. So, finally, we were making progress. Labour restored funding to UNRWA. That's the UN's it's the UN's agency for Palestinian refugees, as I say, the main humanitarian agency in Gaza. A welcome move, even though it should be said the European Union and many European states, including Israel's staunchest ally on the continent, Germany, having done this many months before. After dilly-dallying and briefing that the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, was chickening out, the government announced it was scrapping a departing gift to Israel from the Tories, an attempt to wreck the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor's requests for arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. It was further reported that it would act on legal advice, making it clear that Israel is violating international law, which places a legal duty on Labour to cease selling that state weapons. All of this reason to cheer. Yes, it is absurd that we have to cheer the bare minimum, in this case, respecting international law and not directly facilitating genocide. But this is a question of life and death on a mass scale. Anything at this point is a step forward. It's something. So it became something of a disappointment, to say the least, to discover that Labour was only contemplating banning some weapons, with some artificial distinction being made between weapons that could be used for defensive or offensive weapons, as if that can truly be made in the first place. As the campaign against the arms trade also noted, suspending arms sales to Israel is meaningless if it does not include components for F-35 fighter jets, which are raining death and destruction on Gaza. They add that the UK industry makes 15% of the value of every F-35 fighter jet, including key elements such as the fuselage, targeting lasers, bomb release mechanisms, and critical electronic systems, all key in the committing of war crimes. But now we discover that Labour is delaying making such a decision. Well, according to Jewish News, senior Jewish Labour stakeholders took part in frank and engaging discussions with ministers before the decision was made, with one leading figure, described as a key supporter of Starmer, reportedly expressing concerns about such a move. Now, clearly, like other minority groups with a long history of suffering bigotry, Jewish Labour supporters have the right to organise and make their views heard. There should, however, be a strict demarcation, which we all observe, between the behaviour of the State of Israel and the Jewish community. What representations were made here exactly? We know that the Board of Deputies of British Jews has strongly condemned even the mild shift Labour has offered, as has the Chief Rabbi, who demanded an urgent meeting. With all due respect, what business of theirs is it? It's Britain's approach to a foreign state committing terrible atrocities. It's so important that we emphasise what should be a sacred demarcation between the State of Israel and the Jewish people. Furthermore, let's listen to the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, here.
We want a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel along a viable, sovereign Palestinian state. We're committed to recognising a Palestinian state as a contribution to a peace process at a time that's most conducive to that process.
I must press him further on government recognition of a Palestinian state. This should have been a starting point 30 years ago. I believe recognition would level the playing field and would kickstart the peace process, which has been recognised by so many of our European counterparts. Recognition should not be at the conclusion. So what will the government do if Israel refuses to entertain any moves towards a two-state solution, which they have persistently and vocally rejected?
Well, what that means in practice is Labour's attitude to an independent Palestinian state is what Spanish people would call mañana mañana, an undefined moment in the future, which means never in practice, or could mean never. Because, you see, that is handing Israel a veto. Its Knesset, or parliament, just voted overwhelmingly to oppose a two-state solution. The Israeli state will only ever understand deeds, not empty words, and that means placing pressure on Israel. That has to be huge pressure, because at the moment they have no intention of ever allowing an independent Palestinian state of any description. Now, we should note that, as is, most countries on earth have recognised Palestine. Most recently, that's Spain, Ireland and Norway. Britain, under Labour, is an outlier. Indeed, let's listen to David Lammy again.
Can I say to the Honourable Gentleman, there is absolutely no abandonment of our close ties and our relationship with Israel, and it was hugely important for me to speak to both the Prime Minister and the President to reiterate that, of course.
Look, we're talking about state committing genocide here. How low are our expectations when it feels like a utopian fantasy to expect our government to impose sanctions on a state committing grotesque human rights violations? Instead, it's lauding its alliance and trying to assuage people, try to calm people's nerves that Britain would ever have some rupture with the Israeli state, even as it commits some of the worst crimes of our age. Yet, Labour's refusal to accept the basic humanity of Palestinians remains all too evident. David Lammy issued a tweet on Thursday, marking 300 days since this horror began, which mentions the suffering of Israelis, but had not a single word to spare for the Palestinians who've been butchered, maimed, starved and displaced. The horrors they have suffered for months. And after months of this suffering, any respite, as I say, any respite for the Palestinian people has to be welcomed. But how low the bar's been set. On a daily basis, the Israeli state has committed some of the worst crimes of the 21st century in full public view, a live-streamed genocide, with the full complicity of the British government, which can't even bring itself to scrap arms sales. The lesson here is clear. It is only pressure on Labour which has succeeded in bringing it to this point. The answer then, surely, is to make sure that pressure only gets greater. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments, do leave your thoughts. We are updating the podcast now properly, so listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. If you don't want to see my face, I wouldn't put myself in your position, let's put it that way. Press like, subscribe. I think I've already said that. I'll speak to you soon.